They told the guests the marriage was complete when the torches burned low and the last cup of wine was drained, but every Roman in the courtyard knew the truth. The wedding was only beginning. Beyond the laughter, beyond the garlands crushed under careless feet, beyond the songs meant to drown out unease, there waited a night that polite histories would never name. 2,000 years later, it would still live only in whispers, scraped into the margins of texts, hidden behind words like custom and duty. This was the night when love was irrelevant, when law and ritual stepped into the bedchamber, and when a bride learned how little her consent mattered in the machinery of Rome. Livia stood motionless as the final knot of her tunic was tightened. Her mother's fingers trembled, though her voice remained steady, rehearsed by generations of women who had performed this task before. The wool scratched Livia's skin, dyed the ceremonial saffron that marked her as a bride, a color meant to symbolize joy and fertility. It felt instead like a warning. Around her, the house hummed with celebration, yet the room itself seemed to shrink, its walls bearing witness to something they had seen too many times. Livia was 16, her hair parted carefully with a spearhead, an ancient gesture said to recall the days when Roman brides were taken by force. Everyone laughed at the symbolism. No one questioned why it still existed. The procession had been loud, deliberately so. Guests shouted crude jokes, friends sang verses that balanced between humor and threat, and boys ran ahead carrying torches, lighting the path to the groom's house. Noise was protection, they said, a way to confuse jealous spirits. But Livia sensed another purpose beneath the tradition. The clamor masked the bride's fear. When her sandals crossed the threshold of her father's home for the last time, she had not looked back. Roman custom forbade it. Looking back meant regret, and regret was dangerous in a society that demanded obedience before happiness. Marcus Valerius waited at the other end of the city, a man twice her age with a reputation polished by public virtue. He had spoken kindly to her during the betrothal, had praised her modesty, her silence, her lineage. None of those things required knowing her. Marriage in Rome was not a union of souls but a transfer of guardianship. Livia would pass from the authority of her father to that of her husband, her body a vessel for heirs, her will legally submerged beneath another man's name. This was accepted as natural order, as unquestioned as the stones of the Forum. When she arrived, she was lifted over the threshold by Marcus's arms, a gesture meant to recall ancient abductions and prevent ill omens. The crowd cheered. Livia's heart hammered against her ribs as she felt his grip tighten, not cruelly, but firmly, possessively. Inside the house, the air smelled of oil lamps and fresh bread. The household gods had been honored, sacrifices made, prayers spoken. Everything was correct. Everything was prepared. The feast that followed blurred into a haze of voices and movement. Livia sat beside Marcus, her eyes lowered, her words few. She drank watered wine because she was told to, because a docile bride was praised, because resistance would only prolong what everyone knew was coming. Around them, men spoke of politics and property, women exchanged knowing looks, some sympathetic, others hardened by memory. No one mentioned the bedchamber, yet it hung over the evening like a shadow that lengthened with each passing hour. As night deepened, the guests departed one by one, leaving behind trampled flowers and overturned cups. The laughter faded. Servants cleared the tables with practiced speed. Finally, only a handful of women remained, older relatives and attendants whose duty it was to escort Livia to the bridal room. Marcus disappeared briefly, as custom dictated. The groom was not meant to witness certain preparations. The bride, however, was never spared. They led her through a narrow corridor to a chamber lit by a single lamp. The bed was already prepared, its linen stiff and white, symbols of purity that felt almost mocking. One of the women closed the door. Another began to loosen Livia's tunic, her hands brisk, impersonal. This was not cruelty, it was tradition. They spoke softly, offering advice wrapped in warnings. Be still. Be quiet. Do not anger him. Endure, and it will pass. What the public ceremonies concealed, the women understood all too well. Roman law assumed consent where none was given. A wife was expected to submit fully to her husband's rights, and on the wedding night, those rights were absolute. The rituals surrounding the act were meant to sanctify it, to transform fear into duty, pain into virtue. In some households, witnesses lingered outside the door, listening, ensuring the marriage was consummated. The proof of blood on the sheets would silence any later doubts. Failure was not an option. Livia's attendants finished their work and stepped back. One placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing once, not unkindly. "You will be a good wife," she said, as if goodness were measured by endurance. Then they left her alone. The silence was heavier than the noise had been. Livia sat on the edge of the bed, her feet barely touching the floor, her thoughts scattering. She tried to recall the stories told by poets, of love and devotion, of husbands who cherished their wives. Those stories had always sounded distant, unreal. Tonight, reality was the sound of approaching footsteps. Marcus entered without ceremony. He closed the door behind him and regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. In the lamplight, he looked older than he had during the feast, the lines on his face more pronounced. He spoke her name, testing it, as if claiming it anew. Livia answered because she was expected to. Because silence could be misinterpreted. What followed was governed not by passion but by power. Marcus moved with confidence, with the assurance of a man acting within his rights. Livia's body responded not with desire but with tension, every muscle braced. She focused on the lamp, on the small pool of light trembling on the wall, counting her breaths. This, too, was a learned behavior, passed from woman to woman like an inheritance of survival. Outside the chamber, the house slept. Inside, the ritual completed itself, indifferent to her fear. When it was over, Marcus turned away, already drifting towards sleep. Livia remained awake, staring into the darkness, her understanding of marriage rewritten in a language she had never been taught but was now expected to speak fluently. By dawn, the servants would come. The household would resume its rhythms. Livia would rise as a wife, her status altered, her role fixed. No one would ask how she felt. The brutality of the night would be folded neatly into silence, preserved only in her memory and in the unspoken knowledge shared by Roman women across generations. This was the truth Rome buried beneath marble and myth, that its most sacred unions began not with love, but with conquest carried into the most intimate of spaces, repeated quietly, night after night, until it felt eternal. Morning did not arrive gently. It crept into the room through a narrow slit between the shutters, a thin blade of pale light that cut across the floor and rested against the foot of the bed. Livia noticed it before she noticed anything else, because it meant the night was over, and because it meant she was expected to rise transformed. Her body felt heavy, unfamiliar, as though it belonged to someone else. Marcus slept beside her, breathing evenly, already reclaimed by the ordinary comfort of rest. For him, the ritual had ended. For her, it was only beginning. When she moved, even slightly, pain answered her. It was not dramatic, not the kind sung about in tragic verses, but dull and persistent, a reminder written into muscle and skin. She swallowed it down, just as she had swallowed her fear hours earlier. Roman women were not taught to speak of such things. Silence was a virtue, endurance a form of dignity. She sat up carefully, drawing the sheet around herself, and waited for the knock she knew would come. The door opened without ceremony. 2 servants entered, eyes lowered, movements efficient. One carried fresh water, the other clean garments. They did not ask how she felt. They did not need to. They had seen this morning too many times. One of them glanced briefly at the bed, at the sheets gathered carelessly by Marcus in the night. There was a flicker of recognition, of confirmation. Everything had gone as it was supposed to. They helped Livia wash, the water cool against her skin. She winced despite herself, and the older servant paused for just a moment, her hands hovering. Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange passed a lifetime of understanding. Then the woman resumed her task, expression carefully blank. Sympathy was dangerous. Sympathy led to questions, and questions led nowhere a Roman wife was permitted to go. Livia was dressed again in respectable garments, no longer saffron but modest white and muted earth tones. The color of a bride was reserved for the ceremony, the color of a wife was restraint. Her hair was arranged differently now, bound and controlled, signaling her new status to anyone who saw her. When she looked into the polished bronze mirror, she barely recognized herself. The girl from yesterday seemed distant, sealed away behind her eyes. Marcus rose later, refreshed, and greeted her with an ease that unsettled her more than cruelty would have. He spoke of household matters, of a meeting he would attend later in the day, of how she should familiarize herself with the servants and the stores. His tone was instructive, proprietary, but not unkind. He expected gratitude for that. Livia nodded, answered when spoken to, stored his words carefully. This, she realized, was the true lesson of the wedding night, not the pain itself, but the knowledge that her inner world was irrelevant to the life she was now required to perform. Later that morning, women from both families arrived to formally acknowledge the marriage. They kissed Livia's cheeks, praised her composure, remarked on how well she carried herself as a matron. Compliments disguised as assessments. One older aunt adjusted Livia's veil and murmured that the first night was always difficult, that it grew easier with time. Livia did not ask what easier meant. She suspected it did not mean kinder. Food was brought, rituals observed, offerings made to the household gods. Livia participated because participation was mandatory. Each gesture reinforced her transition from daughter to wife, from protected property to productive one. In Rome, a woman's worth was measured by what she could provide: heirs, alliances, stability. Love was optional, affection incidental. Duty was everything. As days passed, the memory of the wedding night did not fade as she had been told it would. Instead, it settled into her, shaping her reactions, her silences. Marcus visited her bed regularly, as was his right. Sometimes he was distant, sometimes impatient, sometimes almost gentle in a way that confused her more than roughness. She learned to anticipate his moods, to adjust herself accordingly. This was survival, not intimacy. She wondered if he noticed her withdrawal, her stillness, or if those qualities pleased him. Roman masculinity prized control, and a compliant wife was the ultimate symbol of a man's order over his world. Outside their home, Rome carried on, magnificent and indifferent. Processions filled the streets, courts debated laws, temples echoed with prayer. Livia watched from behind latticework, a spectator to a city she was now bound to serve indirectly. Her body was part of Rome's future, but her voice had no place in its present. This contradiction gnawed at her in quiet moments, when she allowed herself to think too much. Occasionally, she encountered other women, wives like herself, their conversations careful and coded. They spoke of children, of household concerns, of recipes and servants. Rarely, in the softest tones, they spoke of husbands. A raised eyebrow, a sigh held a fraction too long, conveyed more than words ever could. Livia learned to read these signals, to understand that her experience was not unique. This knowledge was both comforting and horrifying. Comforting, because she was not alone. Horrifying, because it meant nothing would change. One afternoon, months after the wedding, Livia visited the baths with a small group of women. The steam softened the air, blurred edges, created a space where voices felt less dangerous. As they sat together, one younger woman began to cry quietly, her shoulders shaking. No one rushed to her. They waited, respecting the unspoken rules. When she finally spoke, she confessed fear of her own approaching wedding night, her voice trembling. The older women exchanged looks heavy with memory. "It passes," one said finally, not convincingly. "You learn." Another added, "It is the way of things." Livia listened, her chest tight. She wanted to say something honest, something that acknowledged the violence hidden beneath ritual, but the words lodged in her throat. To speak them aloud would be to tear open a wound Rome insisted on keeping covered. Silence, again, was safer. That evening, Marcus announced that he expected an heir soon. His tone suggested anticipation, pride. Livia felt a wave of panic beneath her composed exterior. A child would bind her more tightly to this life, to this man, to this system that had claimed her body without ever consulting her will. Yet refusing was unthinkable. Roman law favored fathers overwhelmingly. A woman who resisted her marital duties risked disgrace, abandonment, even violence justified as correction. When she lay awake that night, listening to Marcus sleep, Livia understood something with chilling clarity. The brutality of the wedding night was not an isolated cruelty, not a singular horror confined to tradition. It was a foundation. It taught submission from the very first moment of marriage, ensuring that every night that followed would be shaped by that initial lesson. The ritual was effective precisely because it was normalized, because it was hidden behind celebration and sacred words. She began to see Rome differently after that. The monuments felt colder, the laws harsher. The city's greatness rested on countless unspoken sacrifices, many of them made by women whose names would never be recorded. Their endurance was Rome's invisible mortar. Livia did not yet know how, or if, she would ever resist this fate. But a quiet awareness had taken root within her, fragile and dangerous. The wedding night had taught her what Rome expected of her body. The days that followed were teaching her what it would cost to reclaim even a fragment of herself. And somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of learned obedience, a question stirred that Rome had no answer for: what would happen if the silence finally broke? Time reshaped Livia's understanding of endurance. What had once felt like an endless present slowly became a sequence of days she could observe, measure, survive. Seasons turned, and with them came new expectations. When she conceived, the household responded with quiet triumph. Marcus smiled more often then, a public warmth that contrasted sharply with the private certainty that her body no longer belonged to her at all. The pregnancy altered how others treated her, how servants moved around her with increased care, how older women regarded her with something like approval. She was fulfilling her function. Rome rewarded usefulness. Yet pregnancy also granted her a strange kind of protection. Marcus visited her bed less frequently, more cautious now, more invested in the outcome than the process. Livia used the space this created to think. She learned the rhythms of the household, the ways power flowed quietly from room to room, from command to compliance. She learned which servants could be trusted with small mercies, which women carried their own silences like armor. Knowledge became her refuge, her rebellion subtle and inward. When the child was born, a son, the house erupted in celebration. Marcus hosted a feast, invited friends, offered thanks to the gods. Livia lay in her chamber, exhausted and hollowed, listening to joy echo in hallways she could not enter. The baby was placed in Marcus's arms first, lifted and acknowledged as his heir. Only later was the child returned to her, warm and fragile, a living tether binding her to the life she had been forced into. She loved him instantly, fiercely, and that love terrified her. It gave Marcus leverage he did not even need to threaten. Motherhood altered the texture of her fear. It was no longer only about survival, but about protection. She watched how boys were taught entitlement from their earliest years, how sons were praised for assertiveness daughters would be punished for. She vowed silently that her child would not grow up blind to the cost of Rome's order. How she would accomplish that, she did not yet know. Years passed. Livia's body bore the marks of repeated births, some surviving, some not. Loss was treated as inconvenience, grief as weakness. She learned to grieve privately, to fold sorrow into the hidden spaces of her life. Marcus remained consistent, neither cruel nor compassionate enough to be remarkable. That was perhaps the most insidious part of it. There were no bruises to point to, no dramatic cruelty to condemn. Only a system functioning exactly as designed. As her children grew, Livia's position in the household solidified. She was respected now, consulted on domestic matters, trusted with management. Authority, she discovered, could be wielded quietly. She used it to protect other women when she could, to soften commands, to delay punishments, to arrange marriages with marginally better outcomes. These were small acts, invisible to history, but they mattered to those they touched. In this way, Livia learned a different language of resistance, one Rome could not easily punish because it barely recognized it. The memory of her wedding night never left her, but it changed shape. It was no longer a wound that bled openly, but a scar that informed her movements. She understood now why Rome buried that ritual beneath celebration and song. To acknowledge its violence would be to expose the fragility of the entire structure. If a marriage began in coercion, what did that say about the virtues Rome claimed to embody? It was easier to erase the truth than to confront it. She saw the erasure everywhere. In poems that praised obedient wives without asking how obedience was achieved. In laws that spoke of family honor while granting husbands absolute authority. In histories that recorded battles and triumphs but omitted the quiet suffering that sustained them. Women like Livia appeared only as names attached to men, their inner lives deemed irrelevant. As Livia aged, younger women began to seek her out, drawn by her reputation for fairness, for listening. They asked questions carefully, circling the truths they feared to name. She answered just as carefully, offering neither false comfort nor explicit condemnation. She taught them how to survive, how to retain fragments of themselves, how to recognize power even when it was disguised as tradition. Sometimes, in rare moments of privacy, she spoke more plainly. She told them that what happened on the wedding night was not sacred, no matter how many gods were invoked. That it was not love. That it was not their fault. These conversations were dangerous. Words carried weight, and Rome did not tolerate challenges to its social order. Livia understood the risk, but she also understood the cost of silence. She had lived it. If the truth could not be shouted, it could at least be passed hand to hand, voice to voice, like a fragile inheritance. Marcus grew older, slower, more concerned with legacy. He spoke often of honor, of how their family would be remembered. Livia listened, her expression composed. She knew that history would not record her thoughts, her endurance, her quiet defiance. It would remember Marcus as a respectable citizen, a father, a husband. It would say nothing of the nights that shaped her, the rituals that taught her submission before she had the language to question it. When Marcus died, after a brief illness, the house entered a period of mourning. Livia performed her duties as a widow with precision. She wore the correct garments, observed the required rituals, accepted condolences. In widowhood, she experienced a freedom so subtle it almost felt imaginary. No one came to her bed now unless she permitted it. Her body, at last, belonged to her in a way it never had before. The realization brought both relief and grief for the years she could never reclaim. As time softened her memories, Livia found herself reflecting not just on her own life, but on the countless others woven into Rome's fabric. She understood then that the wedding night ritual had survived so long precisely because it was hidden in plain sight, cloaked in joy and legality. It did not need secrecy enforced by law. It was protected by normalization, by the collective agreement not to look too closely. 2,000 years later, scholars would debate Roman marriage, parsing texts and artifacts, arguing over interpretations. Some would dismiss accounts of brutality as exaggeration, others would frame them as products of their time. Few would sit with the human cost of those customs, with the lived reality of women like Livia whose suffering left no monument. But memory has a way of persisting, even when official records fail. It survives in stories passed down imperfectly, in silences that feel too heavy to be accidental, in the uneasy sense that something essential has been omitted. The truth of Rome's hidden ritual lives there, in the spaces between words. Livia's life ended quietly, without ceremony beyond what was required. Her name faded, as most names do. Yet the knowledge she shared, the small resistances she practiced, rippled outward in ways she could never measure. Perhaps a daughter approached her own wedding night with clearer eyes. Perhaps a husband hesitated, if only briefly. Perhaps a question was asked where once there had been only acceptance. The brutality of Rome's wedding night ritual was not just in the act itself, but in its erasure, in the insistence that it was natural, necessary, unworthy of scrutiny. To remember it now is to challenge the myths that civilizations tell about themselves. It is to acknowledge that greatness often rests on suffering carefully hidden. And in that remembering, however late, the silence finally cracks.